Welcome to All Things Work. I'm your host, Anne Sparaco. Today, we'll be talking about toxic workplace cultures. It's something many of us can relate to and how it takes a toll on you personally, but it goes so far beyond that. It really impacts overall workplaces, your productivity, how long you stay with that company, and so much more. So, here to talk about this exact topic is Amira Barger, Executive Vice President of Health Communications and Head of DE&I Advisory at Edelman. Welcome, Amir, to All Things Work.
Thanks so much for having me. It's an absolute pleasure to be here.
We are so excited to have you. This is such an important topic, and we are excited to see how you guide us through this journey that can be hard for many people to navigate. So I would love to start off with, can you tell us a little bit about Edelman and your position there?
I get to spend my days there wearing dual hats. As you mentioned, I spend half of my time working across the entire health ecosystem, everything from medical schools, pharma, hospital systems, health tech, you name it. And I help them reimagine their communications for consumers, but also internally for their employees and their workplace environments. The other 50% of my time is I lead our global DEI advisory, and that's working across any and every sector, not just healthcare, but helping everyone from cars to makeup to higher ed reimagine their environments for their employees, but also for their consumers and those who need the products and the services that they offer in the world.
That's wonderful. So, you talked about how your work focuses on the nexus of inclusion and diversity, as SHRM likes to say, and employee engagement. So, how did it evolve into the focus of your role there?
I came to a communications structure very specifically, and a lot of people ask me about my why. Why am I dual practitioner in strategic health communications and diversity, equity, and inclusion, or IND, as SHRM says? And it's only confusing if you don't understand my background. So, all behavior is communication, and all communication is about influencing behaviors. And I truly believe that what people will do at any given moment in time is determined by how they understand and see the world. And how they understand and see the world is determined by the stories that we tell, what we communicate. And so everything that I do, from reimagining employee experiences to consumer experiences, it starts with communications. How are we shaping the world with our words? And we've all heard that colloquialism of words matter. And that's not just a saying, it's absolutely true. The world around us is constructed by what we decide to frame, as we say in communications, what we choose to focus on, how we choose to focus on it. And so I practice this work in a communication structure because I really believe that leaders across every kind of organization need to be better equipped to communicate and to influence behaviors in employees, in consumers, and within themselves.
I mean, hey, they don't say the phrase communication is key for no reason. That really is great. You kind of narrowed it down to that. It really is extremely important, not just what we communicate, but how we do it. And so let's start things off by defining exactly what toxic workplace culture is, since it really varies from person to person, let alone from industry to industry, because everybody, like you said, communicates differently. They see things differently. They hear it differently. Everybody's got that different perspective. So what does toxicity really look like, and how can it vary from that person to person, industry to industry?
Yeah, toxicity is fundamentally about harm, whether that's to individuals' mental health, team dynamics, organizational outcomes, and it might look like persistent incivility, lack of accountability, or inequitable practices. And it can manifest differently across industries, like you mentioned. For example, I think about the high stress field of healthcare that I get to partner alongside every day. Burnout might signal toxicity, while in the tech industry, it could be exclusionary practices or micromanagement. That's how I think about toxicity within our organizations. It's a place in a space where people don't feel like they have the resources or the support to show up as their chosen selves. And I like to say chosen self. I think we hear a lot about authenticity and authentic self, but I say chosen self because depending on the different layers or dimensions of your identity, how you choose to show up is going to be very different in each workplace, in each meeting, in each room, or with each individual person. And so, creating these environments where people really believe I can choose to show up as myself, a Black woman, for example, if I were to use myself as a mother, as a person with a disability, and to know that I'll be accepted, that I feel I belong, and that leaders around me create that space for me to consistently be a part of the organization and what we're accomplishing.
And it must be pretty hard for leaders, to without the right tools and right thought process, to really identify, a toxic workplace culture because maybe the person who might be adding not even just the only reason it's toxic because it's not always just one person, but somebody who might be adding it or allowing it to happen, it might be hard for them to even identify it themselves, right?
Oh, absolutely. And, part of that is capacity building in my mind is you have to give leaders and individuals the tools to understand. And I'm glad you started the conversation with a question around definitions. In the world of communications, every client engagement, every workshop, we start with defining terms. What does inclusion even mean? What does diversity mean? What does toxicity look like? So that people know how to identify them, and that's capacity building. You have to give people those tools so that they can show up better, because when they know better, they'll do better. But you have to impart that knowledge and that skill set.
And I love that you talked about, the chosen person, like how you choose to show up to work. I really love that perspective. It's a very eye-opening, in how you see it. We talked about how this, type of certain types of toxicity or many, if not all, can really take a toll on your mental health and
Mhm.
overall well-being. And the SHRM Global Culture Report, which we will actually link to that in this description of this episode, found workers who say their mental health is harmed at work report a 37% increase in absenteeism, 18% reduction in productivity, and a 60% increase in work errors. Now, that those numbers, obviously vary a little bit, but they show a problem is persisting when it comes to that domino effect, that toxic workplace culture taking a toll on your mental health, therefore takes a toll on the work itself, therefore takes a toll on the broader organization.
Mhm.
Oh my gosh, if you just think of it from that perspective, it really helps you want to nip it in the bud a little bit. And this is kind of why we're talking here today. So what are the first steps to nip it in the bud to identify that right away that organizations can take to reduce the impact of
Mm.
toxic workplace cultures?
I like to start with an evidence base. In the world of both communications and inclusion and diversity, we talk about being data informed. And so I always start with organizations, assess your workplace culture. That can be through your employee surveys or focus groups to identify how are people feeling, right? Are there shared sentiments around a particular concern or issue area? What's the root cause of the toxicity within our specific organization? Because no organization is one and the same, right? It's going to
Right.
be different whether you're in one part of the country or another, if you're big or small or medium sized, and empower employees with access to mental health resources, all the things that they need. Flexible work policies and schedules, inclusive benefits so that they have work benefits to go to. I think about those employee assistance programs, EAPs, and big topic of conversation right now in the world of work is mental health access and resources for employees across every issue they might be encountering, whether that's caring for an ailing parent, caring for a child. Menopausivity is a big topic of conversation right now for women. There are resources that, as an employer, we can provide. But going back to your question, so how do we take steps to reduce the toxicity in our cultures? It's just start with an evidence base, start with the data, use the tools that you have from your employee surveys, do a listening tour, I
Mhm.
really understand what middle managers are hearing in particular. I talk a lot about the powerful middle, and that was coined by McKinsey years ago because middle managers or a person's direct line manager has the most impact on their experience within an organization long term. And Fortune reported just this last year, 2024, because we're in 2025, I can't believe that.
Wow.
They reported that over 60% of managers are accidental managers, meaning they were promoted for their individual contributions and their technical skills, which they're amazing at. And they weren't necessarily provided the tools that they need to be a powerful manager. And organizations have to think about that. If middle managers have the greatest impact on employee experiences, addressing their needs, addressing their opportunity areas or skill gaps is one of the best things that you can do to mitigate toxicity in your cultures so that they can help to model the kind of behavior we expect in our culture so that they can be an active listening ear to employees' concerns, bring those concerns to leadership, and help to make decisions that advance a new experience and environment across our organization that doesn't reward or tolerate toxicity.
And I think a lot of people can relate to that. Middle managers, they have such a difficult position, where they kind of are sandwiched in between, two challenges here. There's satisfy the higher up and the overall goals, and they're trying to also adhere to, kind of what their employees asking for and listen to what they need. And I think a lot of us can relate to maybe having that people middle manager who struggled with that quite a bit. I personally have where that person was struggling from toxicity higher up. This is outside of SHRM, of course, and that took an impact on how this person, worked with me and my coworkers. So it got to the point where I even went to this person and said, "Hey, are you okay? Like, what's going on?" Actually talked it through, and it helped us understand that, this is what both of us need, and how we can make it easier on ourselves. So that's really awesome that you address kind of like that middle manager area, because it is a challenge. So it's something to
Yes.
that they also need to identify, like that listening tour, like you said. But spotting toxicity isn't always really obvious to people. Because we said it comes in different shapes and forms. So, what are some of the at least key warning signs of a toxic workplace culture that people like middle managers or other
Mhm.
really in the workplace can identify to try to nip it in the bud?
Well, I love the example that you just gave because one of the signals I look for is a culture where people don't speak to one another directly or address issues directly. I love that you went to this individual directly and talked it out. We need so much more of that, right? We're all adults and we need to learn how to engage in uncomfortable or even difficult conversations. And I think that's a signal to look out for within the culture of this organization. Do we go to each other direct? Are we doing the water cooler thing, talking behind each other's back, spinning stories and repeating things? That game of telephone, if you ever played that as a kid, the story gets lost with each person who hears what's on the other side of the telephone. And next thing you know, you've got an entirely different story. So that's something I think we need to look out for. High turnover rates is a really easy and clear one. Is why are people leaving our organization so quickly? And of course, there are some industries and job types where they might be more transient and that might be expected. But for your industry, if that's not the case, benchmark yourself across your peers and is our turnover higher than it might be compared to others? Increased absenteeism, I know that was also in the SHRM report. That's something to think about, and absenteeism can be, even showing up late as a form of absenteeism or, scooting out early. I think what do they call it right now? There's an article I was reading about, coffee break culture, something like that. So that's something to watch out for. We're taking more coffee breaks because, we wanna be absent from what's happening in the 4 walls of our workplace. Yeah, low morale. When you notice a person is a little off or maybe not as vocal as they once were, I always tell people when your employees bring their concerns to you, that's a good thing. It's when they go quiet that I get concerned. I want to know a person cares and values this place enough to critique us, to ask questions, to bring their concerns to managers and to leaders. It's when they go quiet that I get concerned. And that's something to really look out for. Clicks, I mentioned that around the sort of water cooler culture, that's something to look out for. And even exclusionary behavior, whether it's people excluding others or even excluding and removing themselves from things they used to be engaged in, that's something to look out for. They might be either experiencing the toxicity, and so that's a signal of they're not as engaged, or they may be perpetuating it. So I think those are some of the things that managers have the power to look out for because they're closest to the employees day to day and really have the opportunity to see those kinds of behaviors show up and flag them early and often.
I love that you're talking about like leading with, the type of behavior that you want to see in your organization. And it's hard to remind yourself every day, but it's really important. And one thing our president and CEO, Johnny C. Taylor Jr., always says is exercise your empathy muscle. I know I brought this up in probably previous recordings, so my team's probably saying she's repetitive, but it's true. And it's something he really instills at SHRM, because the SHRM Global Culture Report found empathy as one of the main drivers of workplace culture, which is pretty positive. Again, we're linking that report. So how can leaders really use empathy to rebuild trust and accountability in the workplace that's already been affected by, that toxic culture?
It's so good to think about it as a muscle because a
Mhm.
muscle is something you have to strengthen over time with practice and with consistency, or it will atrophy. So it's a good call out. And empathy isn't about lowering expectations. I think some people often couch it that way. It's
Mhm.
about meeting people where they are. And leaders should prioritize listening actively without judgment. I think there's a trend right now. The kids are saying we listen and we don't judge. I've seen
Oh,
a
it's
lot of those videos.
sad.
We listen and we don't judge. So active listening to
Mhm.
really hear and understand a person's experience is
Right.
really important. And when trust is broken, transparency about the actions you're taking as a leader, as a full leadership team, have to be taken to rebuild the trust. That's so crucial to say, here's what happened, here's how it harmed and impacted people. Here's what we've learned, and here are the very specific actions we're taking, and who's accountable for them. People want to see the actions. They also want to know who's going to be accountable, who's the leader that's going to make sure this gets done. And
Mm.
that ties to empathy. Empathy and accountability are two twins that have to go together, right? And set clear expectations while showing understanding of the challenges that employees are facing across an organization.
Mhm. Yeah, I love the accountability part. It's one of our, core principles here at SHRM, is, excellence and accountability. That's like one of the,
Sure.
many pillars that we have. And I think it's actually can be very challenging for someone to kind of own up to that, and take accountability, take the responsibility, in order for there to be effective change. Um,
Mhm.
it's really hard to get people to look within themselves a little bit, is it?
It can be. I mean, self-reflection is a very vulnerable thing to do, is to be introspective, and it's a practice and it's muscle like empathy that you have to learn how to use. And if we go on the muscle analogy, and if you're going to the gym, you don't always know what to do. What do I do with that machine over there, and how do I, work these biceps and get them stronger? You need a guide and you need help, and whether that's a formal coach, a mentor, a peer, or your manager, you need someone to help guide you. And it's a muscle that you have to work to get more comfortable with seeing your opportunity areas.
You talked about, some of the initiatives, that you can take, like you talked about like mentorship. I loved that a little bit. And you talked about measuring, employee feedback. So how do you go about measuring the success of such initiatives to address, this problem?
There's so many different ways. It can be qualitative and quantitative, right? From employee engagement scores, retention rates changing, pulse survey results. Those are all really valuable. But I think an example could be, let's say that an organization implements a new initiative to reduce burnout by offering flexible work schedules and maybe even enhance mental health resources. They could measure the success of that by comparing those employee engagement scores before and after the rollout of those flexible schedules, right? How have people's satisfaction increased? How did their productivity increase? How did their engagement across things like employee resource groups
Mhm.
increase over time? You can monitor those retention rates now that people have flexibility or access to mental health resources or a wellness app. Has that increased the amount of time people are staying with our organization, and has it reduced that turnover? That's definitely a way. I also think about just the day-to-day check-ins that managers can do. How are you feeling about the wellness app? Did you use it? Is it accessible? Do you have questions? And you can measure even just the knowledge. Sometimes people will say, "Oh, I didn't know we offered that." Right? Sometimes that's a measure of people don't know that we have this, mental health wellness app that they can access as a part of being an employee here, and measuring how many people are accessing it and know that it even exists, I think is a really important way to measure that the work we're doing is landing and having an impact with people. Trust is a measurement. I work at Edelman and we are the house of trust. We study and produce the trust barometer every year. And one of the key questions I think to ask always is, do you trust leadership to prioritize your well being? And that can be a one off anecdotal question from a manager. It can be included formally in your employee surveys. And that can tell you a lot about where people stand on levels of trust within the organization, and some follow up questions on how do we increase the level of trust in our leadership.
You've talked a lot on how communication is just so important, and it comes at a vital point when change is necessary for an organization or a company. Change is uneasy for everybody. It's life. We have to admit it, but not everybody and most of everybody doesn't really like it because it makes us uncomfortable and it can create a tense atmosphere if it's not addressed correctly, especially through intellectual communication and honesty, as Johnny would always say. So, how can organizations approach the need for change in a way that minimizes that negative impact on employees?
Begin with transparency. Outline the why behind the change. What's changing and why? Are we merging? Why? Are we moving buildings? Why? Are we getting a new CEO? But why? What's the context? Oftentimes, I think as leadership teams, we announce things, but we forget to give the context for how did we come to this decision. So, explaining how does this change align with our organization's goals and with your day to day role as an employee? And good change management, I just think about the 5 key questions that we always ask. The first is, what is changing and why now? And you need to clearly articulate the driving factors behind change and its urgency. The second question would be, who's impacted and how specifically, so that your teams and your individual employees know what to expect. The third question is, what does success look like? Clearly define, with this change coming, here are the new goals, and this is how we're going to measure progress. The fourth question is, how will we communicate and support employees during this change? They need to know the answer to that question. Who do they go to with questions? Will their manager receive updates, and how often? And the last question, what are the potential risks and how can we mitigate them? The risk of not changing if this doesn't happen, so that employees know and understand the validity and the urgency of why this change needs to happen, that there's a risk to our business, there's a risk to your role if this change doesn't come and doesn't happen.
I would love to wrap up with this. You mentioned how incivility is, a big contributor to toxic workplace cultures. As many might know, SHRM has the civility campaign where we measured incivility in workplaces through our civility index research. We came out with it quarterly all throughout 2024. We're continuing into 2025. We also have a link to that for anybody who wishes to view it. And what we learned, and it's really fascinating, especially in the fourth quarter, we actually hit a record high of nearly 223 million acts of incivility every single day in everyday life.
Wow.
That's the biggest number we have on record. So clearly, we're seeing this tension rising. And the research found, I'm just going to run through a couple of numbers if that's okay. 45% of US workers believe incivility will actually worsen in 2020. From the trend, what we're seeing, it makes sense. And 25% of workers say they will actually leave their jobs because they anticipate that incivility to get worse. Now, incivility can look like a lot of different things to a lot of different people, just like toxic workplace cultures. Do you have any recommendations for proactive measurements organizations can take to create that culture of respect and reduce that incivility?
You know, I often go back to this concept of capacity building. I think in a lot of organizations, we focus on training and learning and development. I talk about capacity building because it's markedly different. Capacity building assumes, unlike training, that you meet people where they are. That's more investment and it takes more time, but it's more impactful. So I bring that up to say having difficult conversations, which is often what leads to disrespectful or incivil behavior, is that we don't know how to converse. And communication skills have to be learned and they have to be modeled. And so to assume that people know how to show up in our workplaces with all that's happening in the world, because the personal, the professional, the political, they bleed together, whether or not we like it. Because we are whole humans, we are not just working humans, and we bring what happens on the outside in. And so being able to mitigate what's happening within us emotionally, what we're thinking, and then how that influences what we're doing, that's a skill. Difficult conversations, emotional intelligence, and EQ, those are skills that we shouldn't assume people show up with, whether you're a manager or an individual contributor. We have to capacity build in our workplaces people's ability to behave civilly.
All right. A big thank you, Amira Barger, for joining us and sharing your experience and your expertise here on All Things Work. We were so excited to have you on.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
All right, that's going to do it for this week's episode of All Things Work. We have content each week coming out with all of our research and a newsletter on these major but so important topics. And don't forget to follow us on social media, like, share, even comment. We want to hear your thoughts on these topics. That's it for us this week. We'll see you next time.
SHRM.